Well, greetings, everyone. I am Bonnie Watson Coleman. I am the congressional representative from the 12th Congressional District in the state of New Jersey. And I am so glad that you have decided to join the episode, the very first episode of what we are calling the Crown Act Discovery Series, where today we will be discussing the history of expression and oppression of Black hair in America. I was proud to reintroduce the Crown Act in Congress earlier this year. The Crown Act, which stands for Creating a Respectful and Open World for Natural Hair, is a law that prohibits discrimination based on an individual's style or texture of hair by including an individual style of hair that is tightly coiled or tightly curled, locks, cornrows, twists, braids, bantu knots, afros, and any other style of hair commonly associated with the race or national origin in the definition of racial discrimination. This anti-discrimination legislation has passed in 10 states across the country, but it should be in 50 states. And it speaks to why it's so vitally important that we pass this legislation on the federal level. Today, we're going to be talking about the identity connection with Black people and their hair, which has been a reality throughout the history of our nation. With any story, it is important that we start from the beginning. That's why I'm so pleased to have some phenomenal women on our panel today to speak about the history of Black hair identity in America and throughout the African diaspora. Today, we have Dr. Deanna Njai, who is the Folklife Curator of the Smithsonian Institute. She is also the principal investigator and curator of the Will to Adorn African American Dress and the Aesthetics of Identity. And joining her is Dr. Joanne Hyppolite, who is the Supervisory Museum Curator of the African Diaspora at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And she brings with her expertise in African American and Afro-Caribbean material and expressive culture. And so we are very grateful for both of you joining us today. And I would like to give each of you, Dr. Anye, starting with you, an opportunity to tell us more about yourself and the important work that you do.
Thank you so much, Representative Coleman. Actually, this work and the investigations of the connection between African American identity and hair specifically, but also dress as a whole, is something that I'm very passionate about. And just recently, we completed about 10 full years of research and presentation on the connection between African American style, including hair, and concepts of freedom and concepts of identity. And these aspects and these notions are so important, both to our economics as well as to the recognition that our hairstyles are art forms. One of the most accessible but important art forms within the African American community. And just as jazz is recognized as an American music that has its foundation in the African American experience and community, the styling of hair and the great diversity of hair is also very important as an index of our identity and our freedom.
Thank you. And Dr. Hyppolite, please tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you've been doing through the museum and cultural.
Thank you, Representative Coleman. I'm also very glad to be here with you and sharing space with my good friend, Dr. Njai, as well. As you mentioned, I'm the Diaspora Curator at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, where I've been on the staff since 2016. I curated the inaugural exhibition, Cultural Expressions, which looks at 5 ways in which African Americans express culture. And one of them is through style. And in that style section, we also talk about hair as well, other aspects of styling that are common to the culture. As the Diaspora Curator, I look at Black cultures around, particularly within the Afro-Caribbean, but around the globe, and also the diverse groups within the diverse Black groups within the United States itself. I think that's particularly important when we're talking about a dialogue, a conversation like this today, because Black hair politics are global issues. These are problems we're seeing all over the world, and similarly influenced by the same core reason as well. And we also know that African American culture inspires and influences Black culture and white culture around the world, and we're also influenced internally by styles that we see from other places as well. So at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, I'm in charge of curator of record for a number of traditional cultures, cultural forms, and one of them is beauty culture.
You know, I'm reminded, just as a sort of offshoot of this, the way I wear my hair is my personal decision. It is as personal to me as any other decision I make with regard to my body. And it's interesting that we have to talk about this in this context. I appreciate the historical context and the beauty of it and the evolution of it, but to have to be talking about it in the context of societal values or devalues of it, it's really quite disturbing. So I'm really glad we had this opportunity to enlighten people, and I'm glad that we had the Crown Act to respond to it. So I tell you, as you both just mentioned, Black hair has a strong history that certainly goes back before even American slavery, before Africans were brought to America and enslaved. What can you tell us about Black hair textures and Black hairstyles from a historic perspective? And why don't we start with you, Dr. Anjay, and then move on to you, Dr. Hyppolite?
Well, certainly, if you look at the African continent where folks originated, well, actually humanity originated there, but in terms of people of more recent African descent who are in the United States, even when folks were in the various homelands in Africa, there was a diversity of styles and diversity of ways of treating natural hair. There's also a diversity of textures, natural textures of hair. And when one of the things that I love to mention is that when Africans were kidnapped and brought to the United States to help contribute to the building of the country, they brought ways of hairstyling along with that. So I'm sure that many people would remember that cornrow styles, which is a distinct way of braiding the hair, cornrow styles remained in the community. They were brought over from the African continent and continued to be practiced, maybe not in public. And there were actually sumptuary laws in places like New Orleans, where if you were a African descended Creole woman, you had to wear your hair in a head wrap because it was thought that the hair would be too attractive to the enslavers. That was the psychology. But these hairstyling methods were brought over from the African continent, and they have come back in new wonderful ways to the United States in recent years to be worn out in public and contributing to that artistry. But the variety of textures, the variety of stylings were through history a part of the African American experience.
Thank you. Dr. Hyppolite, do you have something you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I'd like to affirm what Diana was saying about the texture varying across the continent. Today, we know, and we're cognizant of the fact that there are many different hair textures within the African American community, but there were also many different hair textures in the motherland, in the continent, across the entire continent for that period of time as well. So often some of what Diana is talking about is that there's nothing new under the sun, that we're actually sort of being reconnected to a larger history that was part of our ancestral African connection. So back in the homeland, there was an incredible range of styles. There was wrapping, there was shaving, there was braiding, there was locking, and you only have to go to any African art museum or African art exhibit and look at the artifacts and the sculptures and the wooden work on display there to see that incredible variety. And the other thing I would also note is that hair was incredibly significant. It embedded, it was not just the variety of styles, but there was status associated with hair. The different styles worn could tell you an African person's social status, their economic status, the tribe that they came from, their marital status in some cases, the work that they did. So there were highly developed systems of identification built into hair, which meant that there had to be a lot of care taken in doing the hair as well.
I think that's a very interesting point that both of you have raised, because it seems that the identity of the enslaved African Americans seemed to be immediately challenged or stripped away almost entirely once they reached the shores of America over 400 years ago. What can you tell us about some of those experiences that are related to hair and identity that enslaved African Americans experienced in this new condition that they found themselves in 400 years ago? And what, if anything, is recorded about the impact these experiences had on enslaved individuals?
Well, this is a great question. And I'm reminded of something that I learned actually in work in Senegal, West Africa, but also has been recorded when oftentimes when young men were of a certain age, they would receive a haircut that reflected the family that they belonged to. And especially during the era of slavery, at least for the time that they were able to have this haircut at a certain age. And I'm talking specifically about what I know from the Wolof experience in Senegal. You would know what, if they were captured, you would know what family they came from. It was a short way of people being able to report back on who was captured and who was ripped from their family setting. But also when people went through the Middle Passage, the horrors of the Middle Passage, and got to the United States again. There was certainly interraid between people of African descent in terms of keeping the hair clean and free of pests and so on, reflecting on that horrendous experience. And just as language was important to remember the continent for a while, here was also an index of where people came from, and for a while, a way of remembering.
So your experience and understanding and learning about that, just sort of familiarity, family contact with your hair and your identity, that's something that you gained through your experience in Senegal. But in this country, during slavery, was there any recognition? Was there any recording that discussed or presented a perspective on what that was happening here, with those cultural experiences as it related to your hair? And if so, is there like information, which I think is just so lacking anyway, about our experience during slavery? And I thank God for all the investigators and researchers for that, where we could actually point to the impact of what happened from that point of departure, the Middle Passage, to arriving here and becoming so such a product of someone else's decisions. Dr. Hyppolite.
Yes, absolutely. The records exist. And unfortunately, the records are largely in the voice and the written hand of the enslavers themselves, the colonizers. They are records of, for instance, reports of having shaved heads as soon as people are brought on board to slave ships. And when you think about what that kind of meant, right? Hair had a significant value. It indicated your family. It indicated your status. It was a communication tool, as Dr. Njai is saying. So you're stripping that away, as well as you're stripping that along with the hair at the same time. And we also know from runaway slave ads some of the styles in which enslaved Africans wore their hair. And we know that they had certain styles, that some of them were shaved heads. We know that they wore them at certain angles. We also know from drawings in early periodicals that sometimes they imitated some of the wig styles that Anglo-Americans were wearing during that particular time. So there are records that exist, written records describing African hair on the continent, as well as African-American hair in the United States during those early periods of time. But accompanying a lot of those records is also a sense of derision and a lot of derogatory references. Black hair becomes referenced as wool, in those descriptions, and there's nothing very complimentary or exciting or even just respectful about what's made of Black hair through those eyes and through those references in those periodicals. And certainly one of the other aspects that was hard and challenging for enslaved Africans when they arrived here was the time that they took away to be able to do hair. We all know that, right, as Black women, how much time it takes to sit and groom our hair. And it's something that Africans took their time with, and they had all the tools and the materials, and enslaved Africans came and had to remake all of those here in the United States. And if you were enslaved, the only time you had to be able to work on your hair would have been on a Sunday. And this is why the ubiquitous head rag that you see on Black women's hair, enslaved Black women's hair, in photographs and in early pictures of them, that's why you see them wearing the head rag so often.
Immediately after the abolition of slavery, though, Blacks in America had a form of freedom. What can you tell us about the ways hair reflected a new sense of freedom for Blacks during that period? And what are some of the ways that reflected a continued sense of submission and bondage? And I guess personal value.
Yeah, well, there's always, as I said, some of the knowledge of braiding and the skills of grooming were always within the African American communities. And what you see after the abolition of slavery, you see people going from doing each other's hair as a family activity, as an activity between friends, to the early development of income derived as people who would style hair, first for special occasions, and then later on for every day. And that certainly you see the ubiquitous hairdressers and barbers and so on playing from very early on an important role in African American economics, where the people who were independent because their income derived from styling of African American hair, they were also free to to be organizers. The barber shop, the place where people got their hair styled, also became a place where the latest news within the African American community could be shared. It became a safe space, and especially during the Jim Crow era, after Reconstruction. But the association again of African American hair and hairstyling with freedom and independence became very, very important, both in terms of the styles themselves and the variety of styles, and in terms of the economics. Frederick Douglass proudly sported his hair in a natural manner. And actually, there are lots and lots of photographs of him and commentary on his incredible hair in within the documents that relate to freedom.
Yeah. Dr. Hyppolite.
And I would say that the reason why we have the Crown Act today is right. It's definitely greater freedom than they had under enslavement, but it's also freedom with a little f, right, rather than a big F, because there are constraints that African Americans feel about how they can wear their hair and what is the best way to look like, and that comes from existing in a society that they exist in now, in which Black features are devalued and considered inferior, and that's skin color, lips, thick lips, wide noses, a bigger body type. Those are America has a standard of beauty that's very European. During that particular period of time, and that has lasted even till today. And African Americans are always trying to figure out ways in which to work within that system, because they also want to advance economically. They also want to get their children educated, move forward in their lives. In order to do that, that sometimes requires them to have to conform to those standards to certain extents.
And I want to get to that, because that's more sort of now, or last maybe 10, 15, 20 years. I'm really interested in knowing, after the abolition of slavery, did we see any particular styles that were dominating the fashionableness of it, the freedom of having the time and the opportunity to do your own hair, the fact that you are free from massa telling you what you could or could not do. Did we see anything? Was it just cornrows? Was it just the Afro? Did you see more sort of elaborate styles that harken back to maybe the original countries from which they came?
That's a difficult question. I think that during that period, right after the abolition of slavery, there was still the idea that to progress in life, that your hair approximated the European standards. I think it isn't for a while, until a bit later, that styles like cornrow being worn in public, or styles like locks being worn in public, were considered acceptable within even the African American community. And it's a direct reflection of the kind of psychological as well as actual oppression and discrimination within the United States that affected that possibility. So I would say that there were several instances where, either informally or even formally, there was discrimination and people losing jobs or not getting jobs because of discrimination against hair texture. And so many people adopted various ways of straightening hair. And I would say that it was both psychological as well as
economical.
Direct. So
Yeah.
you see, well, the pressing comb. You see,
I was going to ask you about that actually.
yeah. You see the pressing
When
comb.
when did Black women start using heat to straighten their hair? What period of time did that start?
You want to take that?
Well, the pressing comb is invented in France in the late 1800s. So, yeah, and the idea of using heat, you didn't necessarily have to have the comb itself, the particular tool to be able to use it. And then you see a predominant use of it rising among African American populations throughout the early 1900s, all the way up until the Black Power movement. It becomes increasingly more common for Black women to wear their hair straightened as a result of the straightening comb.
Mm-hmm.
I do want to say, going back a little bit to your last question, a little bit about the way that they wore their hair, that a really great popular reference to what Black hair may have looked like during the Victorian era is to look today at that Netflix show Bridgerton, and particularly the Queen and the way the Queen is wearing her obviously textured Black hair in these wig styles that conform very much to European standards, but still, still look like the Black version of it, That's, I think, was what was going on during that particular period of time. They may have tried to imitate those elaborate wig coif styles, but there was always something different that made it uniquely Black and uniquely stylistically different, and also incredibly, as always, attractive as well at the same time.
Yeah. I was thinking about that when we were talking. That was a very impressive. She was a very impressive character in that series, and I was very much aware of her hair, the style, and the texture. And I know that you actually, Dr. Hyppolite, you curated a special exhibit in the National Museum of African American History and Cultural Expressions. Can you tell us about this exhibit and how it also relates to the story of hair in America? And can you provide some of the examples of the hair expression as presented in your exhibit?
Sure. I mentioned earlier that I'm the curator of the Cultural Expressions exhibition, which is located on the 5th floor of the museum. And Cultural Expressions looks at 5 ways in which African Americans express culture. And it's not the only 5 ways. It's just 5 of the ones that we chose that we thought would be great to share with the public. The exhibition offers an introduction to African American culture through these 5 forms. So in it, you'll see foodways, you'll see arts and crafts, you'll see social dance and gesture, and you'll also see language. And if you think about, and then you'll also see style, image, and identity, which I'll get to. But if you think about these 5 different forms of cultural expression, again, they are not unique to African Americans, they're for everyone. If I often thought about that exhibition as like going on a trip. If you went to a destination to someplace else, what are the things you're going to notice? You're going to notice the way that people are clothed in different areas. You may notice their different dance styles or music styles. If you go listen to music on the street or go to a concert there, if you go to a museum, you may see their particular forms of arts and crafts or the tourist craft center. And you certainly would notice the difference in the cuisine. And so we have all of that happening within our culture too, within our culture, American cultures too, with all these different subcultures that are part of the United States. When you get to the style, image, and identity section, you're told the story of African American styling preferences, their aesthetic impulses is what we like to call them, the ways in which they like to style themselves. And that's told through the history of clothing and clothing choices African Americans have made over time. It's told through skin color issues and skin color preferences that arose as part of being part of that European and white dominant culture. And it's also told through hair. And we tell the story of hair from the period of the beginning of the straightening comb, because we cover enslavement and the slavery and freedom period and hairstyling there. So we talk about the rise of Black women entrepreneurs like Annie Turbo Malone and Madam C.J. Walker, and the incredible work that they did employing creating new employment for Black women, the straightened hair textures that were more preferred during that period of time, because there was a strong politics of respectability, of wanting to be accepted, wanting to be able to get work, wanting to be able to rise up economically, and African Americans felt they had to conform to European values in order to do that. We talk about what Diana was talking earlier about the psychological effects of that internally on within the African American culture itself, and people often actually turning on each other, and debasing each other because they don't conform to European standards. And then we move on up to the Afro, and the significance of the Afro during the civil rights and the Black Power movement. And certainly there had been people like Marcus Garvey and other people who had spoken to the fact that we needed we need to value our African features and not debase them and think so critically of them. But it's really with the turn in the Afro and the significance of the Afro politically as a way that African Americans begin wholesale taking back their God-given African features and valuing them again, putting them up as high as straightened hair, for instance. And then the exhibition, I was really clear on the fact that I didn't want to end the conversation in cultural expressions on the Afro, because the Afro was in the 1960s and 70s, and then we're here in the museum opened in 2016. So what happened after that period of time? So in the exhibition, we discussed the rise of braiding styles and the popularity of them, and other natural styles that became to be adopted. We go all the way up until today with the multi-textured hairstyles and products that have become $1 billion industry for Black hair today. But we talk about the ways in which there's still, again, that freedom with a little f, that even though that we're acknowledging that there are multiple textures of Black hair and multiple textures of hair in this country in general, and products are being made and sold for them, that if you went into the workforce, there were often times where Black people were discriminated against because they were wearing braids or because they were wearing dreadlocks or anything that was a sort of a more natural hair care style, and that people were being fired from hotels and airline industries. There were policies in places, even at the Smithsonian where I worked at, which discriminate against natural hair, and how difficult that was for the women and the men experiencing that. And the fights, the legal battles that began, as early as the 1990s to try to bring that down, and are still continuing today.
I'm even reminded of a kind of famous actor who was on the Law and Order series, but used to be on a different series. And on the different series, she had a straight hair. But I understood later on, as she's in this series now, that she was simply covering what was her natural sort of braided hairstyle. I mean, so even in that industry, and I think that we should really kind of talk about the implications of the reaction to Black hairstyles on the economic and social and mental well-being of our communities now. And Dr. Njai, I'd like to pivot to you first on this, and then go to you, Dr. Hyppolite, because I think this is a very important sort of, we've moved into a new era now. There was a civil rights movement. I even tried to get the huge Angela Davis Afro, but my hair is naturally straight. I'm not, there's no irony left here on me, knowing that we are 3 different women, 3 different hues, 3 different hair textures, wearing our hair as natural as it can be. And we're still African Americans, so we've got a lot to share and a lot to educate people on. They got a lot to learn. And, I think that they're pretty fortunate to have the diversity of us to deal with. But let us talk about how we went from sort of like a period, I don't know, kind of the 70s and 80s and maybe 90s. The hair was a little bit more relaxed, different European influence. And then all of a sudden, here we are. We're tired. Enough.
Oh, that's right. Representative Watson Coleman, I think that one of the big revolutions in African American hairstyling has been just that explosion of affirmation and recognition of diversity. And I think, first of all, Zora Neale Hurston, writer, anthropologist, folklorist, she said that the will to adorn was one of the most important aspects of African American expression, and she said Negro expression, but the recognition of heritage was very, very important, and the affirmation of natural hair, both for health reasons, especially in the millennial generations, and also for reasons of heritage, were really important. And it came at, as we've been talking about, it came at a cost for the pioneers. But we have people like Melba Tolliver, who way back in the 80s, she dared to wear her hair in an afro. Then bringing it closer up, we have people like Angela Bassett and Viola Davis and so on, who and Whoopi Goldberg, who started introducing these styles as acceptable styles. I'm not going to say that they're the only reasons why people have this diversity of hairstyles. It actually has to do with the fact that, the African American community is not only diverse in terms of our natural hairstyles, but also in terms of our choices and our lifestyle. And as those increased, and as people dared to breach those barriers of hairstyling, we've been able to see the reflections. In the 1980s, when more African immigrant women began to come to the United States, when they came to the United States and started opening up braiding salons, it really increased the variety of skills available and the kinds of elaborate hairstyles that were possible through braiding. When Caribbean immigrants came from and started locking hair and bringing those techniques and that heritage of hairstyle, that also increased. And these various communities, we've shared those hairstyles. So I think that the diversity of our internal community diversity has increased the ways that we are able to wear our hair, and also the identity. So now you can go on YouTube and you can find ways to not only style but protect your hair. And so the idea of protective hairstyles, the ways of wearing additions and extensions and so on, it's just exploded. We have to remember that hairstyling is also an art form, and it's also an economic art form. It's one of the ways that hair artists are not starving artists. They tend to be, part of the mainstay of African American entrepreneurship, as I've mentioned before. And so I think that all of these things have contributed, including our publishing industry, places like Essence Magazine. And we had Ebony before, but Essence and other magazines that are now embracing the new hairstyles.
And more Black women and men and children, are choosing to express themselves through their hairstyles. And they are being reacted to in many ways, in a negative way, whether it's in the educational environment or in the work environment. And I see two areas being impacted here. Number one, the industry that went from a very informal community-oriented, familiar-oriented industry and blossoming into a very, strong economic environment, of course. But it also impacts the individual economic well-being of the
Exactly.
person who is wearing the hairstyle in getting the job, in getting promoted in the job, in getting promoted on the job, from what we see sometimes on television to what we see in sort of our local our local employment opportunities. This is what I think the Crown Act is designed to tackle. First of all, one can have an appreciation but have no judgment over how I wear my hair. You
Right.
can like it or you can not like it, but it's a personal decision and it has no impact on you. So the Crown Act is about, you're not going to be able to use that as a way to discipline a child in school, to send someone home and tell them they're inappropriate in dress and hair and whatever. And you're not going to be able to use that as a way not to hire somebody. And so what is it that you think we should be doing to communicate this and to inspire others to appreciate it for the art form that it is, for the freedom that it represents, the individuality and the identity that it represents, without it having a societal judgment associated with it?
I think you definitely have to ask, in each of those situations where someone is being discriminated against, whose standard has been set up here as what is acceptable or not? Why is that the standard? Who created that standard? And why is the way that I wear my hair in violation of that standard? Who created the idea that this is a violation? And hair is just one of those places where you see examples of a systemic racism. It's one of those places where it allows people from a certain set of values and culture to oppress another group unfairly, quite unfairly, and quite obviously unfairly. If you dig deeper and deeper into the roots, because what they are saying is there's only one way that is acceptable, and the only way that is acceptable is something that I have created from my own culture, right, and from my own history. And that's fundamentally, not inclusive, and that's not the America that we want to have here in our country.
And Dr. Njai, is it not the association of the hair and the race and the color that causes people to react, whether it's the employer, the administrator in education, or whatever? Isn't it not fundamentally the discrimination that emanates from your being African American, African descendant?
Oh, exactly. And I couldn't agree with Dr. Hyppolite more that these kinds of discrimination are definitely rooted in systemic racism and the kind of judgments that place one type of hair and one type of skin color as superior to another, as more appropriate than another, and actually as determining what kind of work and what level of society that you're at, and actually even what happens outside of work. The kind of stereotyping, but also profiling that takes place, and this is among men and women. So exactly as you've said, this is a form of racism to discriminate against hairstyling and against the way the agency of African Americans in hairstyling. So these are all things that we must consider.
And we really could have a very long discussion on the sort of styling of clothing that fits into this as well, but that's for another day. I also think it's interesting that the so-called majority culture sees that it's okay if you come in with purple, green, or pink hair, and it can be shaved to one side and pulled over to one side, and you still don't have any kind of reaction to that in terms of judging whether or not an individual is able to go to that school, succeed in that class, or get that job. So, you know, we've got a lot of work to do. Unfortunately, you wonderful, brilliant women, we've got to bring this to a close. And I would love for you to know, number one, how much I appreciate this conversation, how valuable I think it is, this experience. But are there any closing points that you would like to make as we move forward? And I'd like to start with you, Dr. Hyppolite.
I think the more that we accept people's diversity and diversity in all types of ranges, skin color, ethnicity, hair, clothing styles, the more we become that America that we envisioned we would become at the beginning of the foundation of the country, the more beautiful we become as a nation. And it gets us away from these aspects of treating people based on what they see, you know, and looking at core values and affiliations that we may have with people rather than just assuming things just on what they look like.
Thank you. That certainly addresses one of the questions I had about what is the benefit of accepting and appreciating these differences. And Dr. Njai?
Yeah, so very much what Dr. Hyppolite said, but also we do want to recognize both the hairstyling and the diversity of hairstyling as part of the fundamental freedoms of being part of this great nation. And we also want to recognize that this is also an important creative expression and an important part of agency and economic development within the African American community and ultimately within the United States. It's not only an incredible art form, but it is an important industry that employs people, that helps people to rise as entrepreneurs, and that is something that's imitated all over the world. So it has global implications as well.
Well, I tell you, I thank you so much for spending this 45 or 50 minutes with me. I think this is a very important topic, and the discussion was very edifying. The discrimination that occurs in the Black community based upon just this issue alone, although we know you really can't separate this issue from the other issues of who we are, just needs to be addressed. I think we're at that moment and that movement that we need not lose momentum, and we need to be able to course correct now, unlike we've ever been able to do. And this is the moment that we should be pursuing, eliminating all disparities on any level and ensuring that people can move forward based upon, as the Dr. King would say, the content of their character. I mean, obviously the intellect that they have and their willingness to work hard to get to where they want to go, and on none of these external factors that mean nothing in terms of who we are, but certainly will give those who are willing to see us an appreciation of an amazing, creative, and beautiful art form. So I thank you for your work that you do. I hope to see you on my travels back in DC when it's good and open. And God bless you. Thank you for spending this time with me.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you for inviting me.